Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it is not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. And I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen. And bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all of his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him.
Thank you, Jan. So we pray that through all these stories and our singing and our time here together, that we may hear the voice of God deep within us. Recently, you've heard me talk a little bit about fundamentalism, and I've mentioned that this is a worldview that is found not just in Christianity, but it's found in all of the religions. And it's based not just on a literal understanding of the sacred texts, but also, I think, the defining characteristic of fundamentalism. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about this morning. The defining characteristic is this need and a desire to control. In a world that sometimes appears to be careening out of control, fundamentalism attempts to put the brakes on and to establish certain truths that are immutable or unshakable. And then anyone who might threaten these truths only contributes to the chaos. And so fundamentalism is about dealing with these threats, these perceived threats, and about controlling other people. It is about silencing individuals' expression of thought and faith. It's not surprising then that fundamentalism, which seeks to control society, control scientific teaching, and control the lives and the bodies of others, would also worship a controlling God. And this morning, my message is pretty simple. That is, our image of God is important. It is said that our image of God creates us. And so a God who controls will produce people who control others. And a God who is a violent killer will produce violent killers. Yesterday, there was a pride event for gay, lesbian, transgender, and gender nonconforming people up in Coeur d'Alene, about 80 miles to the north of us. And it was reported, and this was a beautiful gathering, a lot of peaceful, gentle, loving people. But it was reported that right-wing extremists, Christian nationalists, targeted this event with violence and intimidation. Police arrested 31 Patriot Front members, and they came from all over the country. This group was mostly not from Idaho, but from all over the country. And police arrested them in order to stop a violent clash with the peaceful pride participants. Now, there were also other extremists there. A group called Panhandle Patriots, I think, was there, and other people who were, geared up with all this military equipment, and they had assault weapons, and that they were actually, there was photos of them walking through the crowd that included, children and families. Clearly, the intent here was to terrify and intimidate and threaten the people at the gathering. The intent was to control. There's nothing Christian about these extremists, but they themselves appeal to a violent and vengeful and controlling God, a God of their own making. It was George Bernard Shaw who once quipped, in the beginning God created humankind, and we have been returning the favor ever since. We often project onto God our own needs and insecurities. So if we want to dominate and control others because of our own fear and insecurity, then we create a dominating and controlling God. As Anne Lamott said, if God hates all the same people that you do, you can safely assume that you've created God in your own image. So there are many of those who pray to a God who is in control, who can change anything, anytime. And most of the time, this God does not act, but simply allows things to happen. And therefore, everything that happens is God's will, according to this image. And so God either makes it happen or God lets it happen. But everything that happens, God controls. From genocide to starvation to mass shootings of children, God is at the controls. That's the image. And the miraculous action of God is only occasional and appears rather arbitrary. This God will intervene once in a while and overrule the natural course of things. And so prayers to this God often express the kind of hope for a swift and decisive rescue. Now, there's something very natural about expressions to this kind of a God. The Bible is full of these, by the way. And I suspect that at one time or another, we all have cried out for a God to step in and take control for us. And how many of us have observed that rare, unexplainable event and have attributed that to God's omnipotent hand. And yet, these human pleas to a God who is in control are just that, human expressions and wishful thinking. Even in the Bible, I believe these kinds of attributions of God reflect more of the desires of the people than the true nature of God. Even though it's comforting to have a God who is in control, there is always a counter voice to this image in our ancient stories. And what's amazing to me is that this counter voice survives at all and makes its way into the sacred text, overcoming this impetus, this human impetus to control. And the ultimate counter voice, I would say, is the person of Jesus. Not the warrior Messiah that reflected the hopeful dreams of ancient Judaism, or the violent Christ reflected in the emotional desperation of the writer of Revelations, but the actual living Jesus. The image and the nature of God, which is reflected in all human beings, is uniquely and vividly reflected in Jesus. So many of us believe. And that image is not one of power and control. It is not one of sheer force and violence, but one of gentleness and vulnerability. And so the God that I pray to is much different than this God who is in control, and certainly the God of the Patriot Front. And I see God's miraculous action as continuous and consistent. There's no place where God is not present and active. This action is not controlling and decisive with immediate results. Rather, I see this action as patient and persistent and gentle. Simone Weil once said that I would like to achieve the kind of radiance that can bring about non-violently what other people might have to do violently. It seems to me that God works that way, with a kind of radiance. Not with controlling force, not with coercion, not with violence. God's way of nonviolence does not offer quick solutions. Gandhi once said, when I despair, I remember all that through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been murderers and tyrants, and for a time they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. As Rabbi Harold Kushner once wrote, God gives us hope in a way that no human agent can. Among humans, Murphy's Law operates. Anything that will go wrong, that can go wrong, will go wrong. But at divine level, there is another opposite law, he said. Anything that should be set right, sooner or later will. Sometimes things happen in our lives that sneak up on us. We might find ourselves in this position that we never expected, and we say to ourselves, how did this happen? And in retrospect, we can look back and we have this feeling that this unseen and hidden reality has been at work quietly and surprisingly. I'm reminded of a story that I read where a psychologist was talking about how when you're parenting, humor is really important. And one of the patients told him this story. A mother was making phone calls in the family room, and her 4-year-old daughter is playing nearby with her 4-month-old brother. And the two children are playing together for hours on end, and the daughter is this wonderful little big sister, and the baby loves the attention that she gives him. And so the phoning mom is not keeping close tabs on the children, and suddenly she realizes that they're not in the room anymore. And so she has this panic. But is soon relieved when she discovers the children playing contentedly in her daughter's bedroom. Annie, the mother says to her daughter rather sharply, "You know that you are not supposed to carry Jeffrey. You are not big enough to carry him safely. He could have been seriously injured." "But Mommy," says her daughter, "I didn't carry him." "Well, how did you get him down the hallway to your room?" she says. "I rolled him," she said. Sometimes things happen and we're not sure how they happened. Quietly, mysteriously, these things happen. Suddenly, we're suspicious that something's different, and we become aware that certain forces have been at work, like 4-year-olds or God have been silently at work. Now, today's story of Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, I think, is one of the most moving episodes in the entire Bible. You know probably the background. Joseph's brothers were jealous of all the attention that Joseph was getting from his father, Jacob. And so, in their youth and in their selfishness, they staged the younger brother's death, and then they sold him as a slave to some traveling merchants. It was like the brother Judah who said something like this. Judah said, "Let's not kill him. What good is he to us dead? Let's sell him. Then at least we get something for him." Well, Joseph, as the story goes, makes it big. He becomes something like a royal therapist, an interpreter of the dreams of the Pharaoh. So then he is made ruler over a large part of Egypt, and this is a real rags to riches story. And because of Joseph's talent and foresight, when there is a famine in the area, in his country, Egypt, it was one of the only ones that had all of these grains of the silos of grain stored up. And so for 20 years, Joseph dreamed of the day when he would get even with his brothers. In one moment, he's living in luxury, safe and secure as his father's favorite son. And the next moment, he's sold into slavery, facing hardship and insecurity. And many a night, he comforted himself with an image of his brothers begging and pleading for mercy before him as they made him to do. And in his imagination, he loved every minute of this dream. He would get even for the injustice and the cruelty of his brothers if it was the last thing that he did. And so then it happened. There was this famine in the land of Canaan, and Joseph, by this time, had been made Pharaoh's minister of agriculture in charge of distributing the grain to all of the vassal states. And so in come his brothers to ask him for some help. And they don't realize who it is. Now, this was the moment that Joseph was waiting for. Now he had them where he wanted them. Now he was going to get even with them. Now, I want to just pause here for a second and ask this question. Where is God in the story? What's happening there? This is a question that many people have asked all through this painful Joseph story. God seems to be silent, conspicuously absent. All of this evil that's occurring, where's God? When we turn back to the Joseph story, we find that Joseph begins to act out his long-held resentment. And so he accuses them of being spies. And then he threatens to keep one of them, the youngest, as a slave. And he seems to be deriving a great deal of pleasure from tormenting his brothers. And so then Judah, of all of them, of all people, tells this great Egyptian ruler that if they go back this time, without the youngest brother Benjamin, that his father Jacob would surely die. And so Judah says, let me remain here as your slave instead, and let the boy go. Let the boy go back with his brothers. I could not bear to see my father suffer again. And then something happens. Joseph found that he was not enjoying this as much as he thought he would. It felt so good in his dreams to hurt them, to get even with them. But now, when the time came, he didn't enjoy it. And he did not like the person he was becoming. Joseph came to the realization that the human soul was not made for jealousy and revenge. And he discovered that this was against his true nature. And he became increasingly uncomfortable until finally he broke down and he cried and he told his brothers who he was. And we are able to look back upon Joseph's story, which is fraught with evil and meanness. And we're able to see traces of that unseen, silent force that is at work gently and quietly from within. Joseph himself sees this, and he's able to break with his past. And he says to them, do not be afraid. Do not be angry with yourselves. For God sent me before you to preserve life. I see that now, he says. Everything has fallen into place for Joseph. He was able to see that God was working in his circumstances, even in the evil ones, to bring about goodness and to preserve life. And so Joseph was able to see these hidden and mysterious presence of God, and he understands now that divine presence is embedded in the world and that God's work and human work cannot be separated. And Rabbi Kushner has a couple of these great stories about how God works in this way, not with control and coercion, but right under our noses for those things that are good. A certain factory had this problem with people employees stealing things. Valuable items were being stolen every day, and they hired this security firm to search every employee as they left at the end of the day. And most of the workers willingly went along with emptying their pockets and having their lunch boxes checked. But one man, came through the gate every day at closing time, and he came through with this wheelbarrow full of trash. And the exasperated security guard would have to spend all this time, at least a half an hour every day, when everybody else was going home, digging through all the food wrappers and the cigarette butts and the styrofoam cups to see if there was anything valuable in there that was being smuggled out. And after all these times, all these days, he never found anything. And finally, one day, the guard couldn't stand it anymore, and so he said to the man, he said, look, I know you're up to something, but every day I check every bit of trash in the wheelbarrow, and I never find anything worth stealing, and it's driving me crazy. Tell me what you're up to, and I promise I won't report you. And so the man shrugged, and he said, it's simple. I'm stealing wheelbarrows. In the same way, we look for God at work, We know that God is up to something. It's right under our noses amidst the trash and the garbage, if we only have the eyes to see. Kushner was also recalled when there was a certain 21-year-old son of his friend that was found to have bone cancer. And his parents had to take him 3,000 miles from home to a hospital in Seattle in a desperate attempt to have him treated with a new experimental therapy. And when word of the problem got out, these astonishing things began to happen. Service clubs organized fundraising drives to help pay for their expenses. One of Seattle's finest hotels invited them to stay at no charge while the boy was in the hospital. Restaurants served them and they wouldn't accept their money. The governor of Massachusetts intervened to direct the health insurance company to assume the costs with what some thought were experimental therapies. And so some might ask, said Kushner, why would God permit a 21-year-old to fall ill with cancer? And he says, I'm inclined to ask, what moves people to respond to tragedy with such generosity and compassion, if not God? What moved Judah to change? What softened Joseph's heart? Are we able to see the wheelbarrow amidst the garbage? Kushner said it so well. He said, having explained cruelty and crime, how do we explain generosity, kindness, courage, and self-sacrifice, unless God is at work on us the way the sun affects a flower, making it grow and blossom and reveal its most beautiful inner self? How else indeed, except for the hidden presence, a presence that is not coercive, that is not controlling, it is constantly at work.